Hello guys, it's the Caribbean Bookworm, and today I'll be giving you guys a bookshelf tour of my bookshelf. Let's go. So some general notes for this bookshelf tour will be that one, not all my books are located on this bookshelf. I actually have more books which I will be showing that are not displayed on this bookshelf, but they're different places in the room distributed. And another rule is that I will not be having all of these books as some of them will be going away for several reasons. And three, the most basic note and rule will be that I will be starting from the top shelf all the way to the bottom shelf and then going on to the other books that are distributed in the room. So without further ado, we shall go through every book and try not to spend too much time on them and going through each shelf individually. So let's go. Firstly, it is noted that above the bookshelf there are some accessories and a large book displaced for decoration purposes and sometimes for reference purposes as well. And down to the first shelf. On the first shelf, you can see several things. So, firstly, you can see several notebooks there, and I use them for several reasons learning languages, learning basic science, etc. And you can also see two other accessories right here and here. This is a diabase, a type of mafic subvolcanic stone or rock. And basically, what this is a stone that formed deep underwater, like a long time ago, geologically speaking. And it formed basically from a volcano. As soon as the volcano erupted underwater, the magma cooled down, in which allowed for mineralization of the various chemicals within this particular stone, and in large proportions, that being things like iron and magnesium, hence why the word mafic. If I focus on the stone, one thing you could see is a bit of a orangey red stripe at several places around the stone, and those are basically places where the iron within this particular stone has oxidized, meaning it has reacted with air molecules and formed a particular type of salt, you could say. The second thing I have being a miniature of Siddhartha Gautama, or Buddha, from the main ideal religious figure of the Buddhist following. And following that, I have several books, having, for example, one being George Orwell's 1984, another one being Hannibal, the third book by Thomas Harris in the Hannibal series. The next book being The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, of which I still have to read. The following book being Frankenstein by Mary Shelley in Spanish. I really want to read that, although the Spanish is a bit difficult for me. Next, I have the main rows of books. I have some top ones here as well, which I'll go through. This being a Dutch book about learning the Latin language, or at least the basics. Here, having, I've talked about this book a couple of times. I've actually read a huge chunk of it, and that's New Moon by Stephanie Meyer, the second book in the Twilight series. Not my favorite, most preferenced series. Another book here being The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova, and this is a book, deceivingly, it looks, by the cover you think it's a history type of fiction, but from what I remember, it's more about vampires. So if any of you have read The Historian, let me know what it's like, because it's a big book and I don't know if I'm going to jump into it or just simply give it away. Next up, we have The Hypnotist by Lars Kepler, a Swedish, if I'm not mistaken, author of which I've heard a lot about, and I really want to read his books, including this one, The Hypnotist, of which I heard is about a serial killer that is also a hypnotherapist, which sounds intriguing to me. So despite the size of the book, I actually really want to go through that one day. Next up, we have The Road by Cormac McCarty, one of my, actually, it's my favorite, as far as I remember, my favorite start of a book. The whole setting, the whole feeling, it feels very depressing, but I tend to like that tone. I remember starting this book several times, but I've never gone through it completely, despite the book being actually quite easy to read. So that is something I have to go through as well one day. Next up being The Witch of Portobello by Paulo Coelho. And I haven't read a lot of books by Paulo Coelho, but I tend to really like his books. Well, again, I haven't read a lot of books. I've only read actually The Alchemist, and I really like The Alchemist. And going through his bibliography and reading briefly some of the plot of his other books, this was the one next to The Alchemist that really intrigued me, so I decided to buy this one. Next up, we have a Alfred Hitchcock book with several stories of which he was planning to film on TV, or he might have even filmed on TV. I haven't read all of the stories, but I have read some. They're quite suspenseful, similar to the vibe of the movie Psycho, some of them at least. So that makes a lot of sense regarding the fact that it's Alfred Hitchcock. Next up, we have a classic that is The Great Gatsby by Scott Fitzgerald. I'm sorry for pronouncing that author's name. Next up, we have Zen and the Art of Motorcycle. I forgot the name exactly in English. I'm so sorry, but in Dutch you can read the name. Next up, we have The Mist in the Mirror by Susan Hill. I picked this one at school because basically I saw that it was the author Susan Hill who also wrote. I will place the name of this book in like the subtitles, but it's a very popular suspenseful horror book. So that's why when I saw the name of the author and this, read the synopsis, I thought, I want to read that one day. Next up, I have A Clockwork Orange. I'm quite familiar with the classic movie, but not with the literature piece itself. So perhaps one day during a bookathon, I will give this one a go. I remember wanting to read this for a bookathon as well in the past, but that never came to fruition, unfortunately. Next one, I have another classic piece, and that is The Catcher in the Rye by Jd Salinger. And I have read The Catcher in the Rye, and I do plan to reread it again one day to give it a formal book review on this channel. It is one of those books of which I have a slightly unpopular opinion about, in contrast to the whole booktube and bookish community. A lot of people liked Catcher in the Rye. I really didn't like Catcher in the Rye. I thought the protagonist really wasn't that relatable, to be honest, although maybe that's perhaps because of the gaps in periods and such. But I really didn't like the protagonist. I didn't like some of the choices being made. I thought it was very rude. But I digress. Perhaps I didn't dive deeper into the analysis of the character and such. But hence, I do want to give this one another read, perhaps to have a different view of the book. This is a book I bought during a sale that there was here, where they were selling different Dutch books. And this one in particular, I don't remember if it's a fiction or a non-fiction, but it essentially touches upon the topic of prostitution and sex workers and such, and how basically that impacts a lot of lives of individuals and people around them. A premise which sounded really interesting, hence why I bought the book, and the book was also really cheap, although honestly, I don't know if I'm planning to read it anymore. At the time, I thought that I will be reading it, but as time progresses, the less I think that I will be willing to give it a shot, unfortunately. Next up, I have a classic book in French literature, and that is Bonjour Tristesse by François Sagan. And this author is quite well known within the French community as a classical French author, and perhaps I will be giving this book a read if I have to travel long distances and such. As I don't know much about the plot, but it seems like one of those quick reads, so perhaps I'd give it a read one day. Next up to that, I have a book called The American of President Obama, written by I think a Dutch journalist. The name says it as it is. It's basically a book about several things that were of concern or that went well with the US during the presidency of Barack Obama. There is another book I want to read on Obama, and not essentially this one, but who knows, after perhaps getting more interested into politics, I might give this one a go. I'm not as content on giving this away in contrast with this because I don't see myself reading this one anytime soon. But same for this one. I don't know if I'm going to be reading it too. But in essence, I'm going to stick with it for a longer time. Next up, I have a book called The Wheel of Darkness by two authors, Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child. And this is, in essence, a fiction story about, I think, a cursed Tibetan box. It's part of a series too, and I haven't given this one a shot, although it's one of those books for a long time that I thought, I'm curious to know what this book is about, just because the cover is so intriguing, but I haven't given this one a shot yet. Next up is the book Room by Emma Donoghue, if I pronounce that correctly. And some people might be familiar with the story of this book because it got adapted into a movie, and the movie won several Oscars, or at least one Oscars if I'm not mistaken. It's a movie with Brie Larson, and it's a really intriguing premise and a really good movie as well. I remember quite loving the movie actually. It is about a mom and his child who lives in this room basically, and the child doesn't know anything outside of this room. So the room becomes the child's whole reality. And when the child is during like early puberty, certain things happen which forces him to actually come to terms that there are things outside of this room, and he realizes that the world is way bigger than he thought, and he has to cope with that, as well as several problems the mom is facing. So the premise is really interesting, and I'm very sure the book will tackle even more details than the movie has. So this is a book of which I really want to give a shot as well, similar to The Catcher in the Rye, but this one I haven't read yet, so hence I really want to give this one a shot. Next up are two of my favorite books within the Hannibal series, and that is Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs. I started with The Silence of the Lambs, though I haven't finished it. Red Dragon I have read and finished, and Red Dragon is by far one of my favorite police thriller type of CSI book. Though, again, I haven't read too many of those types of books, so I can't say with enough confidence. But Red Dragon was for sure a quite unique experience regarding reading. It was so thrilling. Despite the book being long, you didn't feel it at all. I got absorbed into the atmosphere and the characters, and it's just so interesting in general, especially the character of Hannibal Lecter and Will Graham. Even the main antagonist of Red Dragon is interesting, but Hannibal, despite not having a big role in Red Dragon, his presence and his influence is still quite crucial to the storyline. Next up, I have two books by Alex Cross, which I bought basically because they were super cheap. I don't know if I will be giving these two away, but I am quite not there in regards to the Alex Cross books because there are a lot of Alex Cross. So I don't know if I will be able to catch up with the literature, but I do have two Alex Cross books, so that's that. But maybe I will be giving it away though because I don't see myself reading these two anytime soon. This is a book that I want to read, and it's by a YouTuber, JP Sears, Awaken with Spirituality. I really love his sense of sarcasm. This guy is amazing. So recently, he's doing some politics stuff, of which I'm not quite on board with, but yeah, in general, his mockery of, say, the new agey type of spiritual gurus and yogis and such is quite awesome, especially in the sense that he maintains character when he does certain sketches on YouTube. And even throughout his book, I read parts of his book, and he still maintains that sarcastic tone throughout the book, and it's so amazing. I love JP Sears, and unfortunately, I haven't read this book completely, but I like the book, and perhaps one day may even give it a book review. It is not a long book. The letters are quite big, so it's an easy read. The sarcasm is a bit hard to get into because throughout the video you can see that he's being sarcastic with his facial expressions and such, but on word you don't know sometimes when he's being like actually sarcastic or when he's actually being serious. But I still want to give this book a full read. Lastly, on the first shelf is the collection of the three Dante's comedies, the Divine Comedy. Basically, they're a collection of poetries about basically Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise or Heaven. And those of you who are familiar with the work of Dante Alighieri knows a little bit about this author, and I really want to give it a go because I read some of the poems that he wrote and they're quite intriguing. And the concept of Dante's Inferno itself is such a classic tale which you hear over and over again in pop culture. So I really want to give the Divine Comedy a go. Next up, we have Cell by Stephen King, which I haven't read yet, but I got this one as a gift from a friend. And next up, this is Misery, also by Stephen King. With this one, I got during a giveaway. Next up, we're going to the second shelf, and I will not be diving into as much depth with this shelf because I noticed that the first shelf was already really long, so I will be going a bit faster throughout the second shelf. Firstly, we have a book on parapsychology, and that is an interesting field of study about the supposed scientific study of psychic abilities or extrasensory perception, if you want to get fancy with it. But basically, especially within the British community, there were in the 19th century, people were interested by people who claim to have some sort of extrasensory perception. So things such as clairvoyance, precognition, telekinesis, etc. And this book is about the history of parapsychology, some of the tests that have been done, and I myself I myself am quite skeptical about this whole shenanigans, we could say. Although there was a time of which I was quite fascinated with the area of parapsychology, psychic abilities, and such, as you will see with two of the other books I have around that corner, but not anymore. Right now, I'm quite skeptical, though I still find this particular book on parapsychology quite a valuable thing to have because I can often find references as to what some of these studies were and how basically the research was a bit flawed, or how the researchers didn't pay much attention to certain statistical anomalies and such. But at the end of the day, just for anyone who's interested in a bit about parapsychology and such, this isn't a bad book, though it isn't a popular one either because it was written by a Dutch author at the Netherlands, so it wasn't that much of a broad audience type of book, and it's also quite old. So if you're interested in knowing particular details about this book, just lay it down in the comments below and I will give you them. Next up, we have one of the only comics I actually have on my bookshelf, and that is one of the Dark Knight books by the New 52 era. And this is the one about Batman and the Joker, called, not the Joker, sorry, Batman and Scarecrow, called The Cycle of Violence. I really liked this comic book. It's basically about Batman and Scarecrow became more of a popular villain during the recent decades. And this is a wonderful story as well, so hence why I really like that one. Next up, we have a book in Dutch about learning German, which I've used several times, but I wasn't fully committed to learning German, so I didn't exactly get too far with it, but that's basically a language learning book. Next up, I don't have a book, but I have a DVD about learning the mandolin. Next up, I have this book, and that is a short story collection book in my native language, Papiamento. And next up, we have The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari by Robin Sharma, if I pronounced that last name correctly. It's one of those books which I don't remember if it's a fiction or non-fiction, but it's basically about finding yourself and knowing who you are, purpose of life, etc. Similar to the books next to it. That is Siddhartha by Herman Hesse. Another book of which I actually want to read, especially since this Dutch cover of the book is quite beautiful. So I actually want to give Siddhartha a go. Next up, we have two classical music CDs, of which I want to play whenever I can. Next one, I have another gift by a friend of mine, and that is the book Cloud Atlas. I don't know much about this book. There is a lot of mystery for me surrounding this book. I heard it's about time travel and such. I don't know if I will give it a go, but I certainly won't give it away either, so, because I remember that this was a really quite fond gift for my birthday, so I won't give Cloud Atlas away. Next up, we have the classic French book, and that is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And I got this one from school. My teacher gave it to me because it was within the French section of the library, but nobody in essence actually read the book. And she thought, you read books, so perhaps you can keep it. I myself, unfortunately, sorry, teach, haven't read it yet. It's quite tough to get through. I started with the beginning of the book, and the French, because it is old French, it is quite tough to understand everything that is going on, but Hopefully one day, as I dedicate more time to my French, I will actually give this a go. I'm just happy to have some French options as well for literature and not just English and Dutch. Next up I have, well, I think I will explain this briefly. That is the SAS Survival Guide. It's a small pocket book of which I carry everywhere with me if I have to travel or go hiking somewhere. It has various good gems regarding survival techniques, tips, and general things you need to know, such as reading the stars to find the sense of direction, reading the wind, knowing certain plants, basic herbology, animals, and such. So it's a really handy book to have. Next up, I have the Introducing Psychology book by the series of A Graphic Guide. I really loved this book. There was a time I was quite fascinated by psychology and actually wanted to pursue psychology as my higher education, but that changed throughout my high school years. But I'm still quite fascinated, and this book gave me a nice bit of insight as to the history and different fields of psychology. Next up, I have a book which immensely helped my presentation skills, and that is, name the definitive book of body language by Alan and Barbara Pease. This is a brilliant book. If you need to have one book on reading body languages, I highly, highly, highly recommend this one. I cannot stress it even more. Next up is another book I bought during sales. Two books that I bought during sales, actually. And one is Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. I think most of you are already familiar with this book, especially with the movie. And next up is The Great Dialogues of Plato, basically by Plato, several dialogues that he had with his students about various topics, which I also want to get into. Next up, I have a book I recently got from school, and that is Animal Farm by George Orwell. Next up is the first book I did a book review for on this channel, and that is World War Z by Max Brooks. Really awesome post-apocalyptic novel, way different than the movie. Next up is a beautiful hard copy of Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Next up, in order to continue with the other books, I have to remove these two things, one of which is a 4x4 Rubik's Cube that's missing a little piece of it. It's really hard to turn too. It's not that easy to rotate anymore. And also this box of Albert Einstein, this beautiful souvenir I got when I traveled a couple of years ago. And it contains basically Yu-Gi-Oh cards, so go figure. But next up we have A New Dawn, a Star Wars book by John Jackson Miller. And this is part of the Star Wars Rebels novels, a book which I actually want to read. But when I get into Star Wars Rebels, right now I'm finishing with the Clone Wars, although I have already seen the last seasons because it's so damn good. But I do want to get more into the canon Star Wars novels and even some of the extended universe ones whenever I get the time. Next one is another book about Star Wars, and that is the original trilogy in Dutch, but basically in novel format. The Star Wars A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. I've already read A New Hope, and it was quite awesome actually, so I really want to read Empire Strikes Back, but I gotta have the time for that, of course. And then going to Return of the Jedi. And regarding movies that got turned into novels, I also want to read Revenge of the Sith, since I heard great things about that in book format as well. Next up is the French book Funegarium by Brigitte Aubert. And this book I haven't read either. But it is another French book of which I will not be giving away because it's handy to have some French books in there to read just in case. And next up we have a children's book called The Griezelbus, or at least the first book of it, by Paul van Loon. And this was one of the first books I read when I was a child, completely, thoroughly, and without having actually to read it for school, but just on my own. So this was one of my, first starting books of which got me into reading just for fun. And I really like the cover still to this day. And I read the whole thing, and to be quite honest, as an adult, I'd still give it a go because this was such an awesome book. It's basically a book that about some children some students from school or primary school that get into this bus, and at first they thought they were just going home like after a day of school, but then turns out the chauffeur is a skeleton, and there's a weird man dressed up in jackets with like filled with bones, and he's basically, the bus takes away and takes off into a random destination at a really high speed, and the man starts telling like 10 creepy stories. Like each chapter he tells one creepy story, and they progress and become worse and worse. I think it was 10 chapters or 11 chapters. At the 11th chapter they find a way to get off of the bus, but there are like 6 or 7 of these books, so I haven't read them all. But the Bus is such a classic book, especially if you're from the Netherlands or maybe even from the Caribbean. If you like Dutch literature, this is just a classic thriller or horror book for children. So it's a really awesome book. I really, really, really like the Bus. Next up, we have two books of which I told you guys there was a time I was really into the hippy dippy, esoteric, new agey stuff. The first one being a book about, literally, it translates to practicing paranormal abilities, a book about training your ESP abilities, clairvoyance, telekinesis, and such. There was a time I really believed in this stuff. Not anymore. I don't know what to do with these two books. This perhaps I can give away to some people, since I know some people in my personal life who are really interested in things such as aura reading and chakras and such. But this, I have zero idea what I'm going to do with it. But perhaps maybe just keep it for nostalgia's sake. But yeah, this is a book about ESP, and this is a book about reading chakras and seeing auras and such. I have no use for them anymore, but they're still here. And finally, we have the books here, on the top of the books on the shelf. And the first one being a book of which I didn't have in the past, although I talked about it before, and that is The Elegant Universe by Brian Greene. This pertains to the lower shelf actually, but because there is no more space, I had to fill the top shelf with some of those books as well. The Elegant Universe is a non-fiction popular science book about, basically about string theory, a very popular theory in physics right now regarding a possible theory for quantum gravity. Um, Next up, we have a book about Sherlock Holmes, but basically about the author who wrote the character, the life and death of Sherlock Holmes, if I'm not mistaken. Unless Sherlock Holmes was a real detective. That the book might be about that too, but clearly, as you guys can deduce, I haven't read what this book is exactly about. I just thought it was interesting and bought it. Next up, we have a Stephen book here that I actually really want to read after I'm done with my journey towards the Dark Tower, and that is Revival by Stephen King. It's one of his newer books. I think it got released in 2016 or 2015. Next up, these three books. I have firstly another Stephen King book, Just After Sunset, a collection of short stories. Another book I have is Hex by Thomas Alderheivelt, like the Dutch response to Stephen King. It's a really good book. I read big portions of it, but I never read the thing completely. So yeah, Hex by Thomas Alderheivelt. Because I read it for school, or I had to read it for school, I haven't read the thing completely. I just read portions of it and looked up summaries. But in my own free time, I do want to give this a full thorough read and review. And finally, I have 4 different seasons, basically Shawshank Redemption and other stories such as Stand By Me by Stephen King as well. And lastly, I have 4 other books on this shelf. The first one being another gift I got from the friend that got me Cell by Stephen King and a lot of other books. And this one being 4 After Midnight, or in Dutch it's called Twee Duister by Stephen King. The 4 After Midnight, if I'm not mistaken, is the short story collection that has the stories such as The Langoliers. Next up, I have my first Stephen King read, and that is Gwendy's Button Box by Stephen King, a really short novella. And it's basically about a girl who gets this box, of which is able to unlock her deepest wishes and also the biggest of chaos. And it involves one of my favorite Stephen King characters as well, and my first introduction to him. Um, Next up, I have a mathematician's guide to lightning calculations and amazing math tricks. But the book is basically called Secrets of Mental Math. It's a book about getting better at arithmetics, basically, and additions, multiplication, divisions, etc. And also a couple of other tricks you can do with mental arithmetics. It's quite an awesome book, which, as you can see, it's quite beaten up because I've used it quite often for when it's necessary to know some basic arithmetics. And lastly, on this shelf, I have The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot, a book of which I have read. I got from another friend. This book, I read it. It was quite an enjoyable read, though I am ashamed of not dedicating too much time on my book review for this book, unfortunately. This is a book of which you can go quite in depth with, not only on the medical and ethical side, but also on the personal side. But unfortunately, I didn't dedicate as much time to this book. If in the future perhaps someone is watching this video like all the way and you're seeing The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks and you're thinking, hey, I want to hear you talk more about this, then please let me know. I'd be more than willing to talk more about The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Next up, we have the third shelf, and this is my favorite portion of the shelf, or my second favorite portion of the shelf. And these are my non-fiction books, mainly, or non-fiction, some fiction, but mainly non-fiction. Firstly, we have two non-fiction books. One is a PhD thesis by a doctor of which I am quite familiar with. It's about sickle cell anemia, the PhD thesis. And another one is a book about culture and fear and victim blaming and such. Next up, I have The Masters of the Far East by I think James T. Spalding. No, Baird T. Spalding. Oops, James. But it's a story very similar to the story of fiction works such as Batman Begins, the movie Batman Begins, and Doctor Strange, where you have a couple of scientists going to the Far East and becoming more acquainted with the mystical side of life. This might be the only fiction book I have within this section of my bookshelf. But I am not quite sure whether it's a fiction or non-fiction. I read the first volume of this book, and there are some fantastical things, of which, again, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but just despite this being having some weird claims going on, I still like the book for the content and story because I simply like those books about people going out into the Far East and discovering certain philosophy and such that is quite odd, different from the ordinary Western view. So I like this book. Next up, right behind this big yellow book, we have The Human Body, which is a book I'm not going to talk too much about. It's a basic anatomy book, but I'm not going to talk too much about it because it's not my book. I have to give this one ASAP back to school because I basically am finished with it and have nothing left to do with it. Next up, we have Basic Mathematics by Sergey Lang, one of my favorite book on basically high school mathematics. So this book covers geometry, trigonometry, some basic pre-calc things you need to know, matrices, determinants, and such, or not matrices, but determinants, well, and other things you need to know for basic mathematics. And it's an awesome book, and especially due to the fact that the author doesn't shy away from proving certain things from the ground up. And proofs, as people who are quite fascinated by math may know, proofs are quite essential for mathematics. Perhaps not unless you want to become a mathematician, but it still helps you with understanding certain theorems and certain logical deductions. Next up, we have two books in one, and that is 6 Easy Pieces and 6 Not So Easy Pieces by Richard Feynman. I read 6 Easy Pieces, and they're basically basic physics concepts, and it was quite fascinating. Richard Feynman writes quite clearly and concisely. And 6 Not So Easy Pieces, I read portions of it recently. It starts out, it's more about special relativity, this one book, special and general relativity. Both books, I imagine, are good since Feynman writes really good, and he also has a really awesome lectures on physics. Next up is The Diary of Anne Frank in Papiamento. In Papiamento, it's called Ecas Patras. And yes, this is basically what you already know about Anne Frank and her diary. Next up is a book about not doing drugs and alcohol. Basically, it's more of a book for police and such, which I'm not going to talk too much about. And following that is a red notebook, of which I used to accompany this particular notebook. Disclaimer for the swear here, but that's basically a no beat guide to math and physics. It's a book about basic calculus and basic concepts in physics which uses those calculus. So things such as derivatives and integrals, and how it is often used in introductory physics. So things such as classical mechanics, Newtonian forces, acceleration, etc., etc. Following that, we have When the Air Hits Your Brain by Frank Vertesik, if I'm not mistaken. A neurosurgeon, which he himself have suffered afterwards a type of degenerative disorder. But When the Air Hits Your Brain is an awesome autobiographical book by this neurosurgeon, and it's one of the first medical pop science book of which I've read. I still really like this book and might even reread it in the future. It's If you're interested in becoming a neurosurgeon or just a doctor in general, this is one of those books of which I highly recommend you read, especially if you're interested in neurology or neurosurgery, as he talks a lot about the types of patient he handles with on the neurological side in patients, so in a hospital. Next up, we have a philosophy book or philosophy slash poem book called De Rerum Natura, or On the Nature of the Universe by Lucretius. I literally saw a quote on this book about the author talking about atoms. And it was during a time of which people had no idea about the fundamental building blocks of nature. So I thought that was quite fascinating, and I was curious about what else the author might have wrote in the book. So I bought the book. Next up, we have one of my favorite books on tips for learning languages, and that is Fluent Forever by Gabriel Weiner. And the author basically discusses recent research that has been done within spaced repetition and how important spaced repetition is for learning a language. Spaced repetition in terms of not only seeing flashcards and doing things like Duolingo, but also by the sense of immersion, like looking at news and media within the language that you're trying to learn. Next up, we have the book Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher famous for his nihilistic views of life. But I have this in Spanish, that is Más allá del bien y del mal. Another book I have right here, which I'm not sure I'm going to do much with it, but it's a book about medieval history and just basic medieval history that you actually give for junior high school students. But it's quite interesting, although I'm not going to do much with it. This is another book by another booktuber that I got, and it is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Whoops, I'm not going to butcher that last name, but I'm going to leave it at by Dale C. I saw some interesting tips in this books regarding how basically to come off as more social and more inclusive within a certain group. There are some neat tricks in this book as to regard to making people want to talk with you more. I haven't read the book back to back, but it's one of those books of which I will use as a reference rather. Another psychology book I have here is a book I actually want to read completely, so back to back, and that is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This is an author that I think got the Nobel Prize in economics, if I'm not mistaken. And the book is about two types of thinking fast and thinking slow. Thinking fast being your more intuitive sense of decision making, and thinking slow being your more critical, your more reasoning type of part of thinking, basically the part that involves your prefrontal cortex more often. And next up, we have another book by Brian Greene, that author of The Elegant Universe, and this is The Hidden Reality. I think this book dives more into the speculations about the theories of the multiverse. And another book we have here, which I talked about before, and that is The Magic of Mathematics by Ben Benjamin, the author of which wrote that book called The Secrets of Mental Math. And this is more of a appreciation book about some of the basic fields of mathematics, but how they're so powerful and important. Another book I have here is, I think, my only Stephen Hawking. Yeah, my only Stephen Hawking book, and that is A Brief History of Time. Fun fact about this one, I had this book before, but in Spanish, but during my trip, of which I went to a particular Spanish-speaking country, I gave this book away to one of the tours or people that were doing tours because I just thought it would be a neat gift. But afterwards, I bought this book again and in English, so it wasn't a loss. So yes, A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. I read it, really awesome book, although I haven't read it in the phase of which my mind was like blown because I had already known some of the stuff discussed in this book, but still, nevertheless, really nice read. Next up, I have books by my favorite author, or favorite just science communicator in general, and that is Carl Sagan. This one being Billions and Billions, and it's basically a book on several reflections Carl Sagan had before and after his passage. So his wife basically collected some of his notes and put it in here. And basically, it's, yeah, Carl Sagan reflecting about issues such as climate change, some ethical issues regarding abortion, pro-life, pro-choice, etc. Next up is my all-time favorite astronomy book, and that is Cosmos by Carl Sagan. This one needs no further explanation. Next up, I have a book about simple science experiments, and I often use this one for demonstrating some basic experiments to my cousins or for the open days at school. And it's a really awesome book filled with really simple experiments you can do for younger people regarding science. And lastly, on the vertical displacement side here, we have the book called The Evolution of the Universe by Colin A. Ronan. It's a book originally written in English. I have it in Dutch, and it's a really awesome reference astronomy book on several things. So going from the Big Bang all the way to galactic evolution and the universe as it is right now. It's a really awesome book because it's not only a pop science book, but it actually dives a little bit more into the rigorous methods used during research for astronomy and cosmology, and basically explaining how observations are being done in order to try to test for certain theories. It's a really awesome book. Next up, on the horizontal displacement side, I have some books here, 3 rows of books at least. And firstly, I have a book about Rick and Morty, and that is, I think, The Science of Rick and Morty. Yes, a book of which I'm planning to read, but after I actually start the show Rick and Morty, which unfortunately I haven't started yet. Next up, I have a short introduction to book, and this one being a short introduction to cosmology by Peter Coles. And lastly, I have one of the books by Euclid called Elements. I have the second book, Elements 2, in Spanish. I barely understand a thing about this book, but I will still keep it because it is so beautiful, and it's such a vintage, just a collection to have. Like, you don't read it, but you just have it just so that you can have it. Next up, I have these books, and one being Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything. Second one being Ways to Measure the Universe. I don't know what the exact title is in English, but it's called Measures of the Universe by Kitty Ferguson, I believe. Nextly, I have a short introduction to physics, if I'm not mistaken, but I think this one has a different title. It's not part of the short introduction series, but it's just another short introduction type of book. And lastly, I have 2 books about dimensions, one being Flatland, the novel Flatland, and the other being a book called Geometry, Relativity, and the Fourth Dimension. It dives deeper into the topic of Flatland and also some general relativity. Lastly, I have 3 books, one book being Homo Deus by the author Yuval Noah Harari, also known for the book Sapiens. This one is like a follow-up to that. Then I have another Carl Sagan book, actually my favorite Carl Sagan book next to Cosmos, and that is The Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan. In this book, he explores the topic of pseudoscience, claims of alien abduction, and other things of which are woo-woo and deserves more skepticism. And lastly, I have a chemistry book called The Joy of Chemistry, The Amazing Science of Familiar Things, by Katie Kopp. And this is an awesome chemistry book. It provides like a brief general overview of some topics in chemistry, some actually quite advanced high school topics of chemistry, and some experiments of which you can actually test these ideas in chemistry for yourself at home. Before we go to the next shelf, you can see I have some accessories here as well, a dolphin type of model, something that fell, like a Star Wars model, which needs to be placed up there, and another 4x4 Rubik's Cube, but this one does move a bit better, so yeah. And here we go. This is my favorite portion of my bookshelf, and this is the purely Stephen King section. Firstly, I have The Talisman by Stephen King and Peter Straub. I also have the sequel to this book, and that is Black House. I think it's Pet Cemetery. Black House is somewhere here too. Also, I have Insomnia by Stephen King, another book I'm really looking forward to due to the fact that it takes place in Derry, Maine, and we know about that town like due to it. And also because it has a very important character from the Dark Tower series. Next up, we have the Dark Tower series, this big box set. After reading The Stand and the book Ithaca, I will be going through The Wizard and Glass and continuing on with the series and the tie-in books. I have some miniature things here as well, some cards with a crystal ball, so an octopus thingy right here, and an Emperor Palpatine figure right here. Here I have two books. First one being Pet Cemetery by Stephen King, right here, and the second one being It by Stephen King. I also have two other books right here, and one being, yes, here it is, Black House by Stephen King and Peter Straub, the sequel to The Talisman, and another one being The Shining by Stephen King, which I haven't read yet. Next up, whoops, this one almost fell. I have In the Heart of Atlantis by Stephen King, and also I have Desperation by Stephen King. I just stopped saying the author's name at this point because these are all Stephen King books. And lastly, up here I have Salem's Lot and Rose Madder. Salem's Lot, of which I'll likely be reading after Wizard and Glass, and Rose Madder. Another book of which I heard is quite underrated and I really want to read sometime afterwards when I finish with the Dark Tower series is Bag of Bones. And lastly within this section is Everything's Eventual, 14 Dark Tales, one of my favorite short story collections by Stephen King. The space here was for The Stand, but I'm currently reading The Stand, so there's no need to put it there. And lastly is more of my reference section from my bookshelf. This section contains books of which sometimes I'm not even reading, but they're just books of which I use as a reference. One being this book on the science of cooking. It's called The How and Why of Cooking by, I think, a Dutch author. No, or maybe not even a Dutch author, by Albert Koenders. Yeah, name sounds Dutch. Next up, I have the book The Road to Reality by Roger Penrose, probably one of the most difficult books I have to read on this shelf. It's not a book I'm going to read completely right now because I simply can't. It is quite heavy in terms of science and physics and mathematics. It is basically a book about physics summarized, basically, and the book starts out quite simply, or at least as simple as it can be. It starts with some high school mathematics and some philosophy regarding Plato, Platonic models and such. But afterwards, it gets quickly into some heavy mathematics. It gets into Taylor series, non-Euclidean geometry, and then it just takes off into woo-woo land like so quickly. Like right here, it's already diving into Maxwell's equation, but with an intenser form. instead of differential or integral form, which is insanity. But anyways, we shall not talk further about this book, but I hope to be able to understand it in the future. I have a children's book there, the Quran, a book about music, and some other books here, some IT reference book, another children's book, an anatomy book, and different types of books. So right here under, there are a lot of books of which I use as reference and not as like reading material from beginning to end. But yes, that is in essence my bookshelf. Now on to the books that are not on my bookshelf but which I do want to talk about. Okay, so these are the books of which I want to talk about and they're not on my shelf. One being Sapiens, a book of which I am actually currently reading, but I'm digesting like bit by bit slowly, since it's a really dense book, but it's also a really good book, in my opinion. So Sapiens by the same author of a book I showed in the shelf called Homo Deus. Next up, I have another book in the Introducing series, so the graphic novel introduction, and that is the Introducing Quantum Theory book. I also have another book regarding quantum theory, and that is a short introduction book to quantum theory, similar to the cosmology book in Dutch. I got this one from my physics teacher, and I do plan to give it a go whenever I can in order to find some references regarding certain concepts in quantum theory. Lastly, on this side, I have On Writing, a memoir of the craft by Stephen King. Basically, an autobiography by Stephen King in which he talks about like his career as a writer and just as a person, his personal life. Another book I have right here is a really old book I got at school in Dutch, and it is about infinitesimal calculation, or just infinitesimal calculus. It's basically a calculus book, and that's why the name Infinitesimal Calculus. Lastly, on this side, I have a Stephen King companion book, and it's the most recent book I got, or I got myself. It's a book similar to a biography, but it's a biography of Stephen King's bibliography, if that makes sense. So it goes chronologically into the books he published and explores the ideas behind why he wrote certain things or why he published certain stories at certain times. So I don't think it includes the books from his pseudonym, though. So books from Richard Bachman and another pseudonym I think he had. But it's still a good book to use as like a companionship. So yeah, the Stephen King companion. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the last couple of books of which I have. The only reason they're in this container is because I just don't have a lot of room for them elsewhere. So yeah. So firstly, I have The Outsider by Stephen King. This was given to me by my best friend when he went abroad in the Netherlands, and this is a really awesome book, I'm not gonna lie, especially aesthetically pleasing. I haven't read the thing yet, but I actually want to read the Bill Hodge trilogy before I get into The Outsider, since I heard that there are connections there. So yeah. Speaking of the Bill Hodge trilogy, in here we have them, or at least I have two of the Bill Hodge books. The firstly being the second book of the Bill Hodge trilogy, Finders Keepers, and then Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King, also the first book of the Bill Hodge trilogy. So let me take these two out. I don't have The End of the Watch, which is the third book of the Bill Hodge trilogy, but in the future, I want to read the first two books first. Another book being a book I got from a friend, and that is Under the Dome in Dutch. Another book being a short story collection by Stephen King in his Richard Bachman pseudonym. And lastly, a Dutch novel, of which I haven't even given a go yet because it's still in its plastic cover. But I do want to give these other books a go when I get the chance and when I'm almost done with Stephen King, which is going to be in a long while. But I do want to give these other Stephen King books a read, especially this one, since I heard good things about the story, The Marathon, or I forgot how it's called in English. I think it's The Long Run, if I'm not mistaken. But I do want to give some of the Richard Bachman books a go as well. So yes. So yes, guys, we've made it to the end. If you stuck through the whole videos, as I imagine this video is going to be quite long, my longest video actually, Then thank you so much for staying through my bookshelf tour. Let me know which of the books you'd want me to read, or which one of the books did you really like on my shelf, which one were you the most curious about, and just in general, what else you guys may want to see from this channel. I thank you guys again so much for watching this channel. Remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more, and stay tuned for other videos, book reviews, bookish videos, and more. So yes.